Hello, class. So I am going to make an effort here at giving you enough context to begin to make progress reading Heidegger. We are this week reading chapter 4 of this book by Martin Heidegger, Being in Time. We're reading chapter 4, which is anthologized, the same translation, in our textbook. But I wanted to give you a little bit of context. This is a big book. And in fact, is only half of the projected total book. This is part one. There was never a part two. Part two would surely have been at least as big as this one. So we're just reading one chapter from the first division of the first part of the book. That's one of the reasons it's difficult. Beginning Heidegger at the beginning helps a lot. And to read Heidegger, you really need to make him a project. His reading needs to become a project for you. He is trying to, as we saw when we read The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking, which is the 1955 essay, he's trying to overcome the tradition, metaphysics as anto-theology in Western philosophy. And one of the ways, so that makes him loath to use these terms which are loaded with that onto-theological tradition. Words like substance and, it's just loaded with, or subject. We talk about the subject in philosophy, and he thinks that is just loaded. That's, in fact, one that we are going to try and unpack a little bit in this chapter. The subject, like this Cartesian subject, which is so presupposed in the tradition, it dominates the tradition out of which it arises about the time of Descartes, and it then dominates the rest of the tradition. Heidegger will argue, as we'll see in this chapter in particular, completely gets it wrong. We are not, first and for the most part, subjects over against objects. Among other things, we are co-beers. We are with others as a existentiale. But let's talk about some nomenclature now that we're there. Before we start throwing it around, I'll try and give you a sense of what he means by this specialized terminology. First of all, we are the kind of being for whom being is a problem or an issue. And that is why he has picked on us to be the entity that he will analyze in order to answer the question, what is the meaning of being? Which is the question he's trying to answer in this book. Provisionally, we can use Hubert Dreyfus's one-sentence gloss on Heidegger's meaning of being, and that is the intelligibility of the world correlative to our everyday background practices. I think that is a nice provisional one-sentence explanation of what Heidegger means by the meaning of being that you can sort of put in your hip pocket and read this text or jump right into it and begin to make sense of his project. The better thing to do would be to start at the beginning and read all the way through it and develop your own, but this class we're only reading one chapter. One of these days, I'd like to teach a whole course on being in time. It would be, I think, really awesome. But for now, this is where we're at. All right. So we are that kind. Because we are the being for whom being is an issue, or we are the entity for whom being is an issue, then Heidegger thinks we'll start with the human being. And he has a special term for us, Dasein. Dasein, in ordinary German, basically means existence. But he is capitalizing here. He's choosing it specifically for its etymology, right? It's made up of the words da in German and sein. Da means there, and sein means being, which, so we are the there being, the being for whom there is a there or a here. We are somewhere, we are here. We're the Dasein. And that makes us different from everything else. We have a world. We are worlded, right? And world here as in being in the world, and the other terms that he uses. World is a term, a specific term of art for Heidegger. It's a technical term. It's the world of involvement and relevancies. So the way we talk about the world of sports, or we talk about the world of education, right? It's the world of involvement and the things that show up as making sense relative to the things that we do in those worlds, right? World of education. The chalkboard has a very specific meaning. It shows up for us as intelligible in the world of education because of the things that we do in that world, the everyday background practices, the unreflective reaching for the chalk and writing, in my case, the Greek from Nicomachean Ethics, on the board in order to try and explain to gloss it, translate it a little bit, right? It's because of those practices, unreflective, reaching for the chalk and writing on the board, that it shows up for us as intelligible correlative to the background practices in the world of involvement and relevancies of education. Now, macro world, that's what he means. The world, the total world of involvement and relevancies, okay? The way anything shows up for us as intelligible. We're the beings for whom there are worlds of involvement and intelligibility. At least we are, as he says, world rich. Maybe the lizard on the rock has some sense of a world, but is world poor, and the rock is world less, right? Weltlos is the rock, is Weltlos. The lizard is Weltarm, and the Dasein is Weltreich. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. German is not the best. I can pick at it. I can make decent sense of it with effort. All right, Dasein, meaning of being. The ontological tradition has forgotten the meaning of being, and it's in danger of imposing one final permanent one. Heidegger stressed out about that too in his later work. The technological meaning of being dominates in the late modern age. We got to overcome that with a post-modern age, right? For the Heideggerians, we're not postmodern yet. We're stuck in the sort of hamster wheel of modernity, technological hamster wheel of modernity, and the task is to get out. That's the task of thinking. Going backwards to the other essay, let's get back to being in time. This is 1927. So some other terms that will help you struggle, and it's a good struggle, with Heidegger. Ontic versus ontological. Ontic is about entities. So I keep saying entity or being. In German, the words are sein, which is translated by Macquarie and Robinson as being with a capital B. Now, it's important to note that all German nouns are capitalized. Macquarie and Robinson capitalize it to distinguish it from a cognate word in German, which is Seiendes, which they translate as entity. But it's important to note that they both have the word sein or being at their root. Well, sein is sein, and Seiendes is rooted in. Basically, we have this in English. We could say, I'm a being. I'm a being. A dog is a being. This is, in an extended sense, we might talk about the Red Bull as a being, the supreme being, which is a good example of how Heidegger thinks that is the theological part of ontotheology, right? We can't help but think in our pre-reflective metaphysics as God as some kind of an entity, right? We think of sein as Seiendes. We fail to make the distinction between what he calls the distinction between being and beings, increasingly in the West. So he wants to get underneath that by making this distinction. Macquarie and Robinson do us a solid by translating sein as being and Seiendes as entity, because otherwise it's confusing in English. Hope that helps. All right, so ontic and ontological. Ontic refers to the particular concrete entities in the world. When we talk about the Red Bull as an entity, or as the lizard on the rock as an entity, or the book as a thing, and we predicate properties of it as we're used to doing in the Western philosophical tradition. There's the Red Bull, it's got the property of redness, etc., right? I guess ontic is the more straightforward understanding here, the ontic level. Then there's the ontological, which for Heidegger has to do with being understood as intelligibility of the world correlative to our everyday background practices. So the ontological, he's talking about the categories that things need to sort of fall into in order to be for beings like us at all. I think that makes sense. It's the level of being, capital B, whereas ontic is really at the ordinary level of entities and their properties. The Red Bull is sweet. Ontological, on the other hand, would be what we're going to look at this week. Mitsein, or being with, it's like a category that beings like us have to have in order to be the thing that we are. You can also think of it as, in probably too Kantian of a sense, as the conditions for the possibility of the intelligibility of entities, for them to show up as meaning the thing, what they do, their place in the world of involvement and relevancies. Understanding what it takes for them to fit into what they have to have, so to speak, or categories they have to fit into in order to show up as intelligible in that web of intelligibility. All right, that's the ontic versus ontological. And then there is two other terms that he uses, existential and existential. Existential is roughly correlated with the ontological level. And let's say that this is those actual fundamental or ontological categories, like being with, as we'll see in this reading this week. Being with is an existentiale, or a fundamental category of Dasein's being. And then there's the existentials, which are closer to sort of a flat-footed understanding. On the ontic level, existential refers to individual particular Daseins and what individualizes, so what that Mitsein looks like on an individual level with a particular Dasein, if that makes sense. So existentiale, which is more general, and existential, which is the individual concrete expression of the existentiale. It also roughly maps with existential, maps onto the ontic level, and existentiale maps onto the ontological level. I think this makes sense. Ask me questions below if you don't think it makes sense. I will also, I think you should focus on section, so there's 3 sections in chapter 4. I would focus on section 26 and 27. Not that you shouldn't read 25, but I think 26 and 27 are clearer. What else to say? I have 2 handouts for you this week as well. If you're really struggling with it, I have one by Hubert Dreyfus, his commentary on the first division of Being and Time, and it's chapter 8, which deals with chapter 4 in Being and Time. And then there's also a really great gloss on these sections by Stephen Mulhall. I hope this has given you enough to read it and have questions. So ask me questions below. I'm happy to elaborate on particular passages. What he's doing in this text, in this chapter, is all too brief, I'll say. He's trying to undermine this picture of the individual as a self up and over against objects. That is sort of the traditional understanding that we have of ourselves before we reflect critically in the existential analytic. And he problematizes these, and that's not quite the way it is. In order to be the kind of thing that we are, we have to be with others. There's this existentiale of Mitsein, or as a friend of mine likes to translate it, he's much better at German and Heidegger than I am, as co-being, right? We have this, like, human beings are never alone in an existential sense because it's built into the way we are that we are with others, if that makes sense. And he wants to answer this question of the who of Dasein. So Dasein, creatures, beings like us, for whom being is a problem, we problematize being. So we're going to be the ones who most likely figure it out. He says, what is the who of Dasein? Who are you fundamentally? And the tradition says you're a subject, an I, the ego, right? Heidegger says, well, no, not quite. First and foremost, for the most part, in our average everydayness, when we go about our daily lives, if you take a look at us, if you analyze Dasein, we are somebody else. We are das Man, is the German, translated here as the they. We are usually the one in the, so German that is translated the they in this chapter is das Man, which is more literally translated as the one, not in the sense of the big one or whatever, but in the sense of that we would say in English, he's just doing what one does, right? Unreflective, kind of nobody. In most of our average everydayness, we just go through the world and we just do what one does, right? We're not standing out being authentic and original and individual at all times. In fact, for the most part, we are someone else. There's this quote by what's his name? Oscar Wilde, that is apropos here to our chapter 4, Being in Time. He says, most people, this is Oscar Wilde, most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions, their lives a mimicry, their passions a quotation. So Oscar Wilde means that as a criticism of like the herd mentality, the lack of originality in most people's self-expression. They're not, we might say, authentic. And the way he understands this as a criticism, it is loaded with the value judgment. It's important when you're reading this chapter to realize that Heidegger does not necessarily share that moral value judgment that we are so used to bringing to this kind of a conversation about authenticity and originality, especially in the West. In fact, there's something, I think Heidegger would criticize it as indicative of the value system that arises out of the theological tradition that is rooted in that the value judgment piece here. But there is something profound about it. Oftentimes, we're not original individuals. We are, in fact, other people. We do what one does. We are the they. We do what they do. We say what they say. We say what one says. We think what one thinks. And one of the cool things about this text, especially for a course in philosophy of communication like ours, is that it's talking about the centrality of these structures for our very intelligibility of ourselves and the way that we are intelligible to others. I hope you dig it. Ask me hard questions. There are many.